welcome everybody. I'm Tom Patterson. I'm on the faculty at the Kennedy School, and I think I'm now the senior presence at the Shorenstein Center. And we're here to honor the recipient of the David Nyhan Award, which is given annually to the journalist who best exemplifies David's journalistic values. Some of you probably didn't read David's columns, so let me give you a little flavor of what they were like. Like his fellow Harvard alum, the New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis, David's columns brimmed with knowledge and insight. Like the Daily News, Jimmy Brislin, he was outspoken on behalf of the underdog. Like those of Molly Ivins, David had a really sharp wit. He was a good friend of Senator Ted Kennedy, and Kennedy once remarked that he loved reading a Nyhan column over coffee in the morning. It's the best breakfast treat that he could have, but every once in a while, it gave him indigestion. And he was not above criticizing Senator Kennedy. David was not only a very gifted journalist, he was a gifted man, tall, handsome, graceful. He had been an end on the Harvard football team, and he had the smiling eyes that somehow the gods reserve for the Irish. And he had that great Irish talent for storytelling. If you were in a room and almost everyone was packed in one corner, almost certainly at the center of that corner would be David Nyhan, holding forth and with his stories and his political observations. We've had more than 300 resident fellows at the center in the time I've been there. All of them have contributed significantly to the center, but I think my favorite semester was the one that David was there. We had a couple of other really giant fellows at the same time, and almost every day, filled with ideas, talking about politics, and a lot of laughter, and more than once going across the street at the end of the day and finishing it off with a couple of beers. And then the gift that David was to us was gone unexpectedly, unfairly. He died on a Sunday morning. 2 evenings earlier, my wife Lori and I were out to dinner in Boston with David, and he was really looking forward to the weeks ahead. He was headed off. He was going to leave Boston. He was getting ready to leave to help those that had been victims of the tsunami that had hit Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka. He was not going there as a journalist. He wanted to lend a hand. And that was the same motive, I think, that drove David's columns. His argument is that too much of the news looks up at the rich, the powerful, those in office. We ought to be spending more time kind of looking down, thinking about the downtrodden. Those are the people we need to see. And David spent a lifetime as a columnist, helping us to see and understand those individuals. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Cynthia Tucker, who actually won the Nyhan Prize about a decade ago. I don't know the exact year, Cynthia, but it was about a decade ago. She's going to moderate today's discussion. Cynthia was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2004, 2006, and then won it in the commentary category in 2007. The year before that, she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She has a widely read column, appears in newspapers around the country, focusing on political and cultural issues. For nearly 20 years, she was the editorial page editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and she was also the paper's Washington-based political columnist. Currently, kind of in a scholar's position, journalist in resident at the University of South Alabama, where she specializes in political communication, media literacy, narrative nonfiction. Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you, Tom. I am delighted to be here, both as a former winner of the Nyhan Prize and as the moderator for this session. I want to once again congratulate this year's winner, Shawn Donnan, whom I will introduce. Shawn is an award-winning senior writer for Bloomberg News, where he covers economics with an emphasis on where policy meets people, which we'll be talking about some. He writes across the organization's many platforms, from including Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. He joined Bloomberg in 2018 from the Financial Times, where he served as world trade editor. Prior to that, he was the Financial Times World News editor, coordinating the paper's global coverage of economics and politics. Over a 16-year career at the Financial Times, he also worked as a correspondent and editor in Indonesia and Hong Kong, from where he edited the paper's China coverage. He began his career in journalism at the Associated Press, which he joined as an editorial assistant in the Baltimore Bureau in 1993, after graduating from Boston University. So he knows something about the city. He is a native of Australia, still loves cricket and rugby, but he has also discovered a love of baseball, and he keeps up with the Red Sox. Is that from your days at BU, Shawn?
Oh, it goes back to that and way before, but it is a passion that I've done my best to pass on to my kids as well. So,
well, we want to get right in and talk about your work. This webinar is aptly titled "Where Politics and Policy Meet People," and your stories are exemplars of that. You write for Bloomberg, whose various platforms are pretty specialized business publications. And many of the business stories I read are full of data and quoting economists. And your stories are chock full of data, but they're so much more than that. Your stories are about real people. So tell us what you think is important about that.
I'd love to get to that in a second, but if you don't mind, Cynthia, can I just thank some people?
Of course you may.
Because I'd be very rude of me not to start off with some thank yous. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here with you today, Cynthia. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Nyhan family and the Shorenstein Center for just an incredible honor and prize that celebrates what can sometimes feel like an underappreciated brand of journalism. And as someone who, as a journalist, grew up reading the Boston Globe, having my name anywhere near David Nyhan's is an incredible honor. I am a tall man, I am a large man, but I think my kids would tell you that I am not a graceful man. So to hear Tom describe David that way rang home and filled me with envy. To be associated with any way with the Shorenstein Center is equally glorious. This is really where some of the best thinking about journalism, society, and politics is happening today. And that's one reason this is a real honor. Cynthia, as I've said, it's an honor to be with you. I do have to thank some of my bosses at Bloomberg as well, who make this all possible. There are many of them, but I have to single out a few. John Micklethwaite, who sets a high bar at the very top of Bloomberg News. Stephanie Flanders, who called me almost 5 years ago and asked me to join from the Financial Times. Simon Kennedy, who runs our economic coverage globally. He's a fan of the England cricket team, which is a rival to the Australian cricket team, and we still somehow manage to get along. Joel Weber at Businessweek, Michael Shepard, who oversees our US political coverage and was kind enough to put my name forward for an award that is labeled as one in political journalism. and again, I'm an economic journalist. And finally, a huge thank you to Peggy Collins, our Washington bureau chief, who at one point early in 2020, I guess in early March of 2020, came to me and said, I'd like you to go off and tell me about the damage out there in the US economy and tell it in your way. And that was the most incredible assignment. And it's from that really the work that I've done over the last couple of years has happened. There's always a few editors that were directly and intimately involved in the work. Top of that list is Robert Friedman, who I hope is listening today. For the past 3 years, Robert's been a wise voice in my ear, and he's made every word better. Christina Lindblad at Businessweek has a fantastic ability to understand both economics and storytelling. And Danielle Sachs at Businessweek was also involved in some of this. A lot of this work, and you know this, Cynthia, journalism is a team sport. And I had collaborators on some of these stories. Ann Choi, who's one of the most talented data journalists working in America today, Hannah Levitt and Chris Cannon, who really helped with our work on mortgage lending, Jason Grotto, who was an incredible sounding board through that project, Reed Pickert, who's an economics reporter here in Washington and incredibly talented. I worked with her and Madeline Campbell on a dive into the unemployment system in your former state of Georgia. And finally, Dina Bass, who helped me navigate the world of artificial intelligence for one of the stories that I did. I need to give a shout out to my family finally, Cynthia, before we get to the conversation. My mother, Briggy Donnan, I believe, is watching from afar in Australia.
Oh, wow.
Cool. She's up early, so she deserves thanks for that at the very least. And Rachel, Lucy, Aiden, and Toby, who I think is the best dog in the world, are all there, hopefully, and they all make me better, and so on. To get to your question, Cynthia, and I apologize for all those thank yous, but I really needed to get those out of the way.
No, don't apologize. And Robert,
because there's always a lot of
thanks for the shout out, by the way.
there's always a lot of people out there who help in our work. Look, I think, you know, Bloomberg has a pretty core mission, which is serving our terminal clients, those people who pay for our premium service, and they are smart and they are rigorous and they demand a high level of economic coverage. But we also know that those people can be informed by the world outside. And I approach economic journalism with the view that an economy is its people. It's not just its economists. And that if we're going to be writing about economics, our responsibility is not just to look at the data and talk to the economists, but to really go out there and to talk to people who are suffering or enjoying the consequences of economic policy and what is happening in the economy, to businesses, to really get out there into what sometimes is called the real economy rather than the Wall Street economy, if you will, to go talk to people on Main Street and so on. That is something that I think a lot of us would recognize too few of us do. We do too little in the world of economic reporting. That's partly a consequence of the fact that data comes fast and furious at you, and you don't always have time to do that. But it really is important, especially nowadays, to find a way to add even more value. And just practicing journalism and talking to people is where we add value. And I can't imagine not doing that on a day-to-day basis.
I can't imagine any more valuable advice than that. I started to say to young journalists, but actually to all of us. I think we all need to be reminded that's our value added. So when your editor said, go out and figure out what's going on out there, One of the places you focused on, two of your stories are about Cleveland. Why Cleveland? What intrigued you about Cleveland?
Well, it was the data that took me to Cleveland. It was, and I started off by looking simply for the place that had been hit hardest in the pandemic. And if you looked at the east side of Cleveland, you could see that the unemployment rate had just soared there in March and April of 2020. And that's what kind of sent me in my car and on the drive up to Cleveland on what felt like some pretty lonely interstates at that time, it should be said. And that yielded the first piece that we did, which was to look at how the help that was coming out of Washington at that time, at that time it was $2 trillion, I believe, a rescue package that was being thrown at the economy, whether that was getting to the people who needed it most. And if I asked that question in Washington, I would get a lot of, oh, it's great. Haven't we done a great job getting this out the door? You go to the other end of that equation in Cleveland, and early that summer, I was discovering that the help hadn't landed, that people were having trouble getting access to small business loans. And then in some cases, there were whole communities and whole zip codes that felt like they just weren't aware, weren't getting the help that they needed, and that were in increasingly desperate circumstances. And that was, and that there was already some anger bubbling up at that point.
So you did a really wonderful piece around housing, the disparity between a poorer, predominantly Black neighborhood of renters and a wealthier neighborhood that was thriving. But you also did a piece centered around a church. How did you find the people that you decided to focus on? Because for me, if I were to just venture out to Cleveland, that would be one of the big questions for me. How do I know where to go and who to talk to?
Yeah, look, I think as a journalist, you learn to look for the connectors, right, in communities. And one of my first calls when I was thinking about heading up there was to a pastor called Stephen Rowan at Bethany Baptist Church on the east side of Cleveland. And Stephen Rowan, we spent about half an hour on the phone, and he said, and I asked him, how are people feeling up there? Is the help getting to people who need it? And he said, no. He said, can you come up here? And I said, yes. He said, when can you be here? And I said, I can be there on Tuesday. And he said, okay, 11 a.m. Tuesday, come to the church and I'll see you then. And so really I had that and one or two other appointments. And when I walked in the door to Bethany Baptist Church on that Tuesday morning, Stephen Rowan's assistant led me into the church hall. And in the church hall, all arranged on chairs, socially distanced, 6 feet apart, everyone was wearing masks. We're about 30 or 40 people. And they put me up on the stage. And at the very last minute, Pastor Rowan walked in and said, ladies and gentlemen, this is Shawn Donnan from Bloomberg News. He's here to find out how things are going. Why don't you let him know? And out of that room, I met Tony Jones, who was the barber across the way, who really at one point walked out of the room and motioned to me and said, come see me across the room. I met Miriam Scott, the pastor of First Love Outreach Ministries, who became the main character in the story. And I met a whole series of other people. And but it was really that, the power of meeting that local community leader and just the generosity of that person, Pastor Rowan, to open up to just open the door to his community and to help introduce me. Without that meeting, I would have been lost up there. I would have spent a lot of time knocking on doors. We would have found a story, but I don't think I would have made the same connections that I did that day. And I'm still in touch with some of those folks in that story. Tony Jones, the barber, and I text every so often, and have stayed in touch. And I hope to see him again at some point in the not too distant future.
There, and on the subject of Pastor Rowan, there is a powerful quote that he gave you that I just want to read because I remembered it. You talked about some of the anger bubbling up. He said, you quoted him as saying, "I'm not going to play my people for a fool." He's talking about the fact that much wealthier institutions have gotten a whole lot of assistance, and his community is getting very little. He says, "I'm not going to play my people for a fool. There comes a point in time when I cannot justify or say to them that God will make a way despite what they are seeing right in front of their face." That's a powerful quote.
It is. And a context for that quote is that Pastor Rowan was serving on the ethics panel of the Cleveland Clinic at that time. And part of what was driving his anger was that this wealthy institution nearby, an incredibly important institution to the city of Cleveland, had received $200 million in CARES Act help at the time. And he was angry about that. And he, at the same time, was watching his congregation come to him and in increasingly desperate straits, asking for help from him, asking him where they could find help, how they could access some of this money they were starting to hear about, and so on. It was striking. He was not gonna sugarcoat anything when I was there, and that was also helpful.
So you mentioned the fact that many of the people who subscribe to Bloomberg are there for the data they get from the terminals, but you said they could also be made aware of what's happening out there in the larger world. Who is the audience for your stories? And what difference do you think this sort of work makes to that audience?
That's a very good question. I think we at Bloomberg have multiple audiences. We have our terminal audience, and then we also have Businessweek magazine, and we have a kind of broader consumer audience that's out there. We go out, these stories were all published on the web, and in many cases, I think in most cases, found a larger audience in the general public than they did on the terminal, and so on. But there was also a point that was important to me at that period of 2020, which was we were looking at economic data that in many cases felt broken. It was backwards looking in an incredibly fast moving economic crisis. The unemployment data, it wasn't until well into April that we were getting March unemployment data, and it wasn't, and likewise, we didn't really have a good sense of, there were lots of guesses, there were lots of models, but it was really hard to figure out how bad the damage was just from a data perspective, because the data wasn't keeping up with the crisis. And so we were all reaching for different ways to measure the damage, whether it was restaurant reservations or people going through TSA security checks at airports and what was happening there. And the value of just talking to people, of just picking up the phone and talking to businesses and so on, was huge at that point. And you could put together a pattern. It wasn't, statistically significant data, but you could certainly go out there and record what was happening, what people were saying was happening to them out there. And you were adding value even to our incredibly sophisticated data consuming subscribers who didn't have the data that they were used to and didn't have the data that they needed.
Let's move from Cleveland to my old stomping ground, Atlanta. I loved your Wells Fargo story. In many ways, that's an old story. Journalists have been talking about banks' unfairness to Black borrowers for decades now. I guess one of the things that fascinated me about two things fascinated me about the Wells Fargo story. One was how little had changed. But the other was they had named a Black woman over part of their mortgage business, and she was there both to defend the company, but also, I hope, to make some changes. So would you talk about that story and the fact that Black people with excellent credit ratings still couldn't get refinancing from Wells Fargo?
Sure. We set out to answer a question when we started that project, which ended up with another story that we published in December that I don't think was included in the submission for this. It was all up, it was a 15-month project looking at what had happened in the mortgage market during the pandemic. There was an amazing wealth event that happened in 2020 and 2021 when interest rates fell to historic lows, and Americans who owned homes were able to refinance their mortgages at the lowest interest rates they will have seen in their lifetime, able to tap into home equity at that time. Some $5 trillion in mortgages were refinanced just in 2020 and 21. And we knew that there was a history of Black homeowners not having the same sort of access to refinancing that white homeowners do. First of all, Black homeowners or Black families have a much lower home ownership rate than white families in general. There's a 30-point gap there. It's about 42% home ownership and among Black families versus 72% among white families. So that already means that there isn't that same wealth to tap when you refinance. And to be clear, when you refinance, it's not just about your home payment. People use this to pay for their children's education, for home renovations, to consolidate other forms of debt. It's a hugely important tool of wealth. And what led us to Atlanta and to Wells Fargo was the data. I was working with Ann Choi, who I mentioned earlier, and Hannah Levitt, who is our Wells Fargo beat reporter, and Chris Cannon, who's an amazing visual journalist. And we were working through the federal mortgage data, the annual mortgage data, and Wells Fargo just popped out. They approved only 47% of applications by Black homeowners to refinance mortgages across the United States. They were approving white homeowners' applications at a rate of more than 70% in 2020. And that was striking. And that was a much bigger disparity than we saw among their peers. And obviously we felt strongly that we had to write that. We spent a lot of time going back and forth with Wells Fargo and with Christy Furcho, who you mentioned, who's the head of their mortgage division, who, to be fair to her, had only been brought in the year before that to try and improve the business there. We spent months not just looking at the data, but also thinking about where we could tell the story and who we could find as characters to tell that story. And we zeroed in on Atlanta and on Fulton County in particular. And Ann and I spent weeks going through the property records there locally, looking for people who had had Wells Fargo mortgages and had switched to someone else, thinking that might be an example, a tell of a refinance that had been denied. It's a hard thing to find because this is not being denied a mortgage or refinance is not something
Right.
people are proud of. It's something that comes wrongly, I think, often with some shame attached. And so we struggled, and it took us some time to find people. And then we ended up finding three, really, the main one of which was Moise Ricard, who is a Microsoft, works for Microsoft, and is married to a doctor, and lives in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta. And their initial family home, which they had rented out, they went to refinance, and it just dragged on and on and on and on and on until finally he ended up being denied. And it was astonishing. Moise Ricard at the time had a credit score above 800, which is elite. There's no other way to describe it. There are not many people in America who have credit scores above 800. And the fact that he couldn't get a mortgage refinanced with Wells Fargo seemed to us to be a real tell. That, I was conscious when we went down there of the work that had been done in the past in the Atlanta area. You would know this, Cynthia, but the Atlanta Journal-Constitution really broke or led the way in terms of coverage of redlining in the 1980s with the work that was done and ended up winning a Pulitzer.
Yes.
Work done by Bill Dedman down there. And I was conscious that we were going back there, and I had, in the back of my head, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was kind of honoring that work in a way, and thinking to myself, have things changed? And it's always a little depressing when you find that they haven't necessarily.
And quite frankly, I said that this story has been being told for some time, but I don't think you can tell this story enough, Shawn, because I don't think the average American understands how important home ownership is to generational wealth building. And it's if we don't tell that story, many white Americans are still, don't understand why there is such a huge wealth gap. And this helps explain that. And your work pointed out that these low interest rates signaled a huge opportunity to build more wealth for those who could get in on that bonanza.
And they also accelerated a housing boom that was going on at the time. I don't think we appreciate that the last 10 years have seen the biggest appreciation of housing associated wealth that we've seen really since the end of World War II. It's been a remarkable past decade. And we think sometimes of the story of the Black community being excluded from the housing market as something that happened in the past.
Right.
We know, if you're not familiar with the redlining that happened, that was government sanctioned going into the 1970s. And the maps that literally drew a line around whole neighborhoods and said they were too risky to lend to, and those neighborhoods tended to be Black and other minority neighborhoods. We sometimes think that is behind us, and yet there are all these different ways in which there is inequity in the housing market. And that is hugely important to the story of, as you say, of broader wealth and the broader wealth gap in America. Until you solve that gap, you are going to have a huge structural inequality in America. And I don't think that's the America that the founding fathers or many Americans envision today. And I say that as an Australian.
So I want to be able to leave time for questions. We've got 2 more stories in your submission to talk about. There's a Georgia unemployment story that I'd like to at least touch on, but I definitely want to go to a story that's a little bit different. And that's the ID and me piece.
Yeah. Well, on the unemployment side, I just talked very quickly about that. That was another story that I worked with Robert Friedman and a colleague, Reed Pickard, on. And we had the silly, if you look at national data for the delivery of unemployment benefits, there actually is no data collected nationally on who is rejected for unemployment benefits. And we had the silly idea that we would go out and ask all 50 states. We knew that there was some form of that data that was collected, and that we would ask for that data through open records requests. It took us some time. I think in hindsight, we probably wouldn't have taken that approach again. We learned some lessons as journalists, but we ended up in Georgia. I was lucky enough to end up on the phone with a lawyer at the Georgia Department of Labor who happened to have my open records request in front of him on the desk and called me up. He also happened to be retiring. And he very kindly, after we had some conversations, approved our open records request, which meant we had access to 2 million records for unemployment applications that were anonymized. We didn't have any of the personal details, but we did have the race of the applicants. And again, there we were able to document and how, if you were a Black man or woman in Georgia applying for unemployment benefits, you had a much worse chance of actually getting your benefits than a white applicant. And that was for all sorts of reasons, including rules governing how temporary workers are counted, but also showing that some of the special programs one of the special programs in particular that was rolled out during the pandemic had done a good job of closing the gap, the racial gap in unemployment benefits, which pointed to the need for reform. And it also led us to the ID.me story in a way, because this is a story about a company called ID.me. It's a tech company. It's based just outside of Washington here in Northern Virginia. And they are a contractor. They verify your digital identity. And they are increasingly a contractor for government services, including the IRS, and including a lot of departments of labor at the state level around the country, where when it came time to verify your identity, you would scan your driver's license. They would also do a facial scan of you. You would sometimes have to do a video call through them. And what we discovered through our reporting on unemployment was that a lot of people were getting hung up and were struggling with this system and couldn't get their identities verified. And that, in many cases, the people who couldn't get their identities verified were Black and brown-skinned people whose, for some reason, the algorithm wasn't picking up their face, was struggling scanning their face, or
they had changed their hairstyle.
Or they had changed their hairstyle.
That sort of made me chuckle.
Yeah,
or Shawn, the idea that if you've changed your hairstyle, it can no longer identify you, and therefore you must be a criminal.
Yeah, and it was about an assumption as well that if the system couldn't identify you, then you must be perpetuating fraud in a way. And there's a figure that's still used, it's still rolled out. The CEO of this company, Blake Hall, made headlines when he declared at one point in 2020 that his estimate was that there was $400 billion in fraud or in unemployment benefits that had been stolen. And he was basing that on the company's own data and what they were assuming based on people struggling to get verified. Now, we went and we were able to do open records requests around the country, including California. And one of the things we found in California was that in its own reports, ID.me, and its own reports to state authorities, ID.me was saying only 40% of people who in some weeks who tried to apply for unemployment benefits there and tried to verify their identity were able to verify their identity. Their assumption was that it was 60% of the people who were applying were fraudsters. We were able to drill down a little bit more and prove that wasn't the case. And in the end, just to give you an idea, California was the biggest distributor of unemployment benefits. They represented about a quarter of the unemployment benefits that were roughly $1 trillion in unemployment benefits that were distributed during the pandemic. And their calculation at this point is that roughly $25 billion was stolen there. It's a long way from 25 billion to 400 billion. And these numbers matter.
Yes.
Because they drive the debate. Still here in Washington to this day, we have not seen any significant reform efforts in Congress for the unemployment system because the debate kind of gets stuck on this fraud question. And we still don't know. There was fraud, absolutely, during the pandemic. There was a significant amount of money there were billions stolen in fraud. But we do not yet know the total of that. And we haven't really had the conversation about all those people who were unfairly labeled.
And as you pointed out, a lot of those were among the most vulnerable.
Absolutely.
They were people who had poor internet connections or didn't have a computer at home. And so they would have been people already at the less affluent end of the income scale. This story, though, raised another very important question, I think, and that is whether the government ought to be outsourcing something as important and as fundamental as the identity of its citizens.
Absolutely. And I think that's a question that hasn't been resolved yet. ID.me does work for the IRS. After our story was published, there was a bit of a scandal that broke out here in Washington about its work for the IRS, and the IRS set about reviewing that contract, but they also do work for the VA and for other government agencies. They're not the only company in this space. This is we live our lives online. We are, we do our banking online. We are increasingly, we access government services online. If you want to renew your driver's license, right? Or you file your taxes, or apply for Social Security, or apply for unemployment, it all happens online. And your digital identity really matters. And there's a real philosophical question as to who should control that. We assume that is the role of government, right? I assume that is the role of government. They're the ones that issue driver's licenses.
Right.
They're the ones that issue passports. They're the ones that control your birth certificate, your Social Security card, your all of those key elements. And that's a conversation that I don't think we've really had yet. Or that you haven't really had yet in America. I would tell you that in Australia, People are much more resistant to any private sector involvement in any control of identity.
Well, we've got a couple of questions already, good questions. Let me throw this first one to you from a former AP reporter. He says, I know it's a challenge to get the news services to give you the time and space to do the kind of investigative and feature writing you did in Cleveland, for example. Did you twist arms at Bloomberg to get them to let you do this in-depth work?
Look, I was very lucky at Bloomberg, and then I think I mentioned in my long list of thank yous there that Peggy Collins, who is now the Washington bureau chief, and at that time was in charge of U.S. economic coverage, came to me and said, "I'd like you to go out there and do this," and that she was receptive all along the way and was a great champion inside Bloomberg. For that work. I was also, my other bosses were giving me the space to do that. We're also lucky in that at Bloomberg, we are an incredibly well-resourced news organization, and that we have the spare capacity to do something like that. That is not something that all news organizations do or have. I would say that the great lesson from all of this is, for me, or it's one of the things it's reaffirmed, is you find more readers, you find greater value, you have more impact as a journalist when you put in that effort to go out there, and that we, as at news organizations, need to have that in mind, that we need to, on a daily basis, be getting beyond the commodity news, the story that everyone is writing at the same time, that data release that is important in the first hour after it's released, but maybe less important by the end of the day. We need to think about where we add value and how we add value as journalists and as storytellers, because that can have a real impact on policy. After we wrote that initial Wells Fargo story, Wells Fargo announced that it was setting up a $150 million fund to help Black homeowners refinance mortgages. We also had senators on the Hill ask for investigations by the CFPB and the Department of Justice and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We know that those are things that have happened. It led to a series of class action suits that were filed by individual homeowners and lawyers representing them. That action wouldn't have happened had we not done that work and had we not taken the time to do that work. And hopefully, a little bit of change comes out of that, and the world is a little bit of a better place.
Absolutely. The next question comes from Nick Nyhan, who has a bit of a personal interest in this prize. Nick, I think it is accurate to say, is a big data guy. He's big on data. And he wants to know, how do you decide which macroeconomic data to focus on and then examine it with a more local face? And the second part of his question is, do you see yourself as a data storyteller?
That's a great question, Nick, and thank you so much. You sent me a very generous message earlier today, and I thank you for that. I think I always look beyond the macro data. I try to drill down. I always look for zip codes, congressional districts, census tracts in the data. I always try to find, we are not officially in a recession here in the United States right now, but I think it's fair to say that there are zip codes in this country that have been in a recession for a long time. And I think sometimes the macro data hides the real story of what's going on in the economy. A colleague, Rich Miller, wrote a very good piece just last week about the possibility that what we're seeing in the United States now is a rolling recession that has gone through manufacturing, now housing, perhaps, and we'll move on to another sector of the economy. You can think about that geographically. You can think about that through different income levels as well. I think we need to become more sophisticated about how we tell stories using data. And the first part of that is looking beyond the macro. I haven't answered your exact question there, Nick, but I'm happy to engage later on. And absolutely, I am not the skilled data analyst that some of my colleagues are, but I am a huge consumer of data, and I am guided by data in all of my storytelling. But my God, I need to find a human quickly. Just tell a story with data.
But let me just say, Shawn, your reporting is chock full of data, but it doesn't, the way you use it doesn't bog the story down. It moves the story along, it advances the story. And I love that about your technique.
I would love to claim credit for that. As you know, Cynthia, we all have great editors who make us better.
Absolutely.
And I think Robert Friedman was probably smiling quietly as you were asking that question, because I'm always, I'm the reporter who's always trying to get another little fact into the story. And Robert does a great job of telling me when it's enough and probably stripping out of, the excess fat that's in there. It is a problem that we are, awash in data in the world right now, and that you can be overwhelmed by data. And I think that's one of the most challenging things is not just finding the data, and sometimes having to create your own data sets and go out there and harvest the data yourself, but also in not letting the data overwhelm you and having the discipline to focus and drill down and so on. I see Robert Friedman just put a smiley face.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's because finally, after 3 years of working together, I'm acknowledging that he was right, probably.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about our being overwhelmed by data. But again, to you and Robert and your entire team, I think you use it well. So here's a question for you. What were some other lessons learned about approaches to these and similar journalistic enterprise pieces? This comes from John Gage, retired from Bloomberg and worked at Bloomberg among other places. Lessons learned.
Look, the main lesson learned is, and it's worth it. The effort is worth it, and that we need to raise our ambition each time when we go out there as journalists and embark on these projects. And that it takes time. It's hard. There are times when you will get depressed that you're not making progress, and that you need to kind of lift yourself up, and you need to be kind to yourself. But that this really is, and I am so lucky to be able to do this kind of work, and I am so conscious of the fact that not everyone gets that opportunity in today's media environment. But swing big. There's no point in playing in the the minor leagues are important, but there are so many big issues that need to be attacked in this country, and it's our responsibility as journalists to do that and to put in the hard work and to just never give up.
John, is there anything else? It's about time for us to close out. I don't think we have any more questions. Any final thoughts? Anything I should have asked that I didn't?
I don't think so, Cynthia. You've been very good, and you haven't given me any of the hard questions I was expecting. I thought at some point I would be put through the Cynthia Tucker ringer, and put me on the spot on something. Look, I just thank you very much to you, to the Shorenstein Center, to the Nyhan family. I can't tell you how honored I am to be able to even just be here today talking to you, and to kind of be on that list of winners alongside you and some other great, just some great journalists in American history. And I think to be the first Australian on that list.
Well, Shawn, your work certainly deserved it. Tom talked earlier about the fact that David liked to work, to look not from the top down, but from the bottom up, and your work is definitely exemplary of that. Tom, do you have some final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I just want to congratulate Shawn, and you know, there are polymaths in the world. I don't know if there's such a thing as a polyjournalist, but I loved reading your submissions. I was on the panel of judges, but I was very curious about your journalism, and you know, we've only seen a small sampling here. You write in the business area, you write in the politics area, you write in the tech area, domestic policy, foreign policy. I can only ask you a question about how, with all of those interests, you kind of see the story possibilities that you do. It's pretty remarkable, and I just want to congratulate you, Shawn. This is a really worthy award, and extraordinary journalism on your part.
Well, thank you, Tom. That's kinder than it needs to be. I really appreciate that.
I want to say thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. And thanks as well to my fellow judges, to Liz, who did such a wonderful job keeping us on point. And again, congratulations to Shawn. Thank you.
Thank you.